Marcus Chen had always prided himself on being adaptable. After crash landing on Kepler 442b following a navigation malfunction, he'd managed to survive 3 weeks in the wilderness before stumbling upon the Zephyrian settlement of Velthar. The locals, resembling oversized praying mantises with iridescent blue-green exoskeletons, had been surprisingly welcoming to the strange bipedal creature that had appeared at their village gates. The village elder, Clixtar, had graciously offered Marcus shelter and sustenance in exchange for work. Through a combination of gestures, crude drawings in the dirt, and the universal language of pointing at things, they had managed to establish basic communication. When Clixtar had shown him images of small, round objects and made nurturing gestures, Marcus assumed he was being offered a job in agriculture, perhaps tending to some kind of crop or livestock. Yes, yes, Marcus had nodded enthusiastically, grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the community that had taken him in. I can do that. The next morning, Clixtar led Marcus to a large, dome-shaped building at the center of the village. Inside, Marcus discovered rows upon rows of translucent, egg-like spheres, each about the size of a basketball, glowing softly with internal bioluminescence. Dozens of Zephyrians moved carefully between the rows, tending to the spheres with what appeared to be specialized tools and solutions. Marcus's first task, as demonstrated by a patient Zephyrian named Thrixel, was to carefully clean each sphere with a soft, absorbent material that felt like silk. The process required delicate movements and constant temperature monitoring, skills that came surprisingly naturally to the human. His steady hands and keen attention to detail quickly impressed his co-workers. These must be some kind of exotic fruit, Marcus muttered to himself as he worked, noting the way the spheres pulsed gently when touched. Or maybe they're storage containers for food. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus became increasingly proficient at his duties. He learned to recognize the subtle color changes that indicated when a sphere needed special attention, mastered the art of applying the nutrient solutions at precisely the right intervals, and even developed an intuitive sense for the optimal temperature and humidity levels. The Zephyrians seemed delighted with his progress. Clixtar would often observe Marcus's work and emit the chittering sound that he'd learned indicated approval. Other villagers began bringing their friends to watch the curious human perform his duties with such unexpected skill. It wasn't until Marcus witnessed his first hatching that the true nature of his employment became clear. He was tending to a sphere in the back row when it began to glow more brightly than usual. The other Zephyrians immediately gathered around, their antennae twitching with excitement. The sphere pulsed rhythmically, then began to crack along predetermined lines. A tiny triangular head pushed through the opening, followed by miniature limbs and delicate, folded wings. Marcus stared in horror as the realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Oh, no," he whispered, his face going pale. "Oh, no, no, no. These aren't fruits. They're not storage containers. They're babies," he concluded aloud, watching as the newborn Zephyrian took its first tentative steps. "I've been working in a nursery this whole time." The implications hit him like a meteor shower. For weeks he'd been caring for the village's most precious resource, their children. Every sphere he'd cleaned, every temperature reading he'd taken, every nutrient solution he'd applied had been part of the complex process of raising Zephyrian offspring. Panic set in as Marcus realized the enormous responsibility he'd unknowingly accepted. What if he'd made mistakes? What if his human touch had contaminated something? What if... His spiraling thoughts were interrupted by Thrixel, who approached with what Marcus had learned to recognize as a gesture of gratitude. The Zephyrian extended a specialized tool, one that had previously been reserved only for the most experienced nursery workers. Clixtar appeared beside them, chittering excitedly while pointing at Marcus and then at the newly hatched infant. Other Zephyrians began to gather, and Marcus caught fragments of their rapid, clicking conversation. Though he couldn't understand their words, the tone was unmistakably positive. It slowly dawned on him that he wasn't in trouble. In fact, the Zephyrians seemed to view his care of their eggs as something extraordinary. Through gestures and expressions, they conveyed that the eggs under Marcus's care had shown unprecedented development rates and hatching success. Over the following days, Marcus learned more about Zephyrian reproduction through careful observation and the occasional crude drawing. The eggs required constant attention for nearly 2 months before hatching, and the survival rate was typically around 70%. However, the eggs that Marcus had tended showed a remarkable 93% success rate. The village scientists, distinguished by their elaborate head crests, began studying Marcus's techniques. They discovered that human skin temperature was ideal for certain stages of egg development, and that the oils from human hands created a protective barrier that enhanced the shell's permeability. Most surprisingly, they found that human humming, something Marcus did unconsciously while working, created vibrations that stimulated healthy neural development in the embryos. What had begun as a simple job arrangement evolved into something far more significant. Marcus became the village's first official egg whisperer, a position created specifically for him. Young Zephyrians would be brought to watch him work, learning to incorporate his techniques into traditional practices. As Marcus sat in his new quarters, a larger dwelling that reflected his elevated status, he chuckled at the absurdity of his situation. He'd traveled across the galaxy only to discover that his greatest skill lay in babysitting unhatched alien children. The irony wasn't lost on him. Back on Earth, Marcus had been a bachelor with no interest in children. Yet here, millions of light years from home, he'd found his calling as the galaxy's most unlikely nanny. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A rescue beacon had finally detected his location. A human ship would arrive within the month to take him home. Marcus looked out at the nursery where dozens of healthy eggs glowed softly in their rows, then at the Zephyrian youngsters who had hatched under his care, now taking their first flights around the village. For the first time since his crash, Marcus faced a truly difficult decision. He had a choice to make, and for once in his life, the answer wasn't as simple as he'd expected.